Thanks, Tara. So, as everyone has done today, but it would be very remiss of me not to thank all of the reviewers of this chapter. All the reviews significantly added to the quality, so the quality is thanks to the reviews, and the mistakes are definitely mine. So I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and bring in a little bit of the soil chapter as well, because I feel like you can't really talk about land without also talking about soil. And it's my first time being an author on the SOE report, and the thing that I learned about writing a chapter is the hardest part is writing those main messages at the end. You wouldn't think that trying to condense it all down into 3 or 4 succinct lines would be so difficult and get so many revisions, but it really does. So considering that, I'm going to start with the main messages and then go backwards to how we arrived at those, and then we'll finish the presentation with a little bit of where to from here. So here's the soil messages, and as I said, we took a lot of time crafting these, so I'm going to grossly oversimplify them. But really, when you're talking about soil, what's striking is the vital services that soil provides. And those vital services, which we'll get to now, really do depend on the soil being healthy. There's a soil monitoring law in Genesis, which will be important to protect soil health. And that really, if you want to understand soil health in Ireland, good data is really important to help you to do that. So what are those services? Well, there's so many of them. So soil itself is the largest habitat on the planet. All that microbiome and all those sort of subterrestrial creatures make the biggest habitat in the world. So soil itself has a vibrant habitat. It provides nutrient cycling services. It supplies most of our food, bar the marine stuff, and a lot of our fuel and a lot of our raw materials. Soil is kind of a driver of our terrestrial ecosystem. So if you think about the different kinds of terrestrial ecosystems that exist in Ireland, a lot of those are kind of very key, very importantly linked to the underlying soil. So I suppose the obvious example is peatlands. The soil also provides regulation of water flow, which we see if you place concrete over something, that in flood time you'll see what happens if you seal that soil in terms of flow. It provides regulation of water quality. Has impacts on human health, and then soil itself can be a significant carbon sink, so there's got climate and air quality regulation services. But all of these services that soil provides, it can only do if it's healthy. So how healthy are Ireland's soils? Well, if we look at the European picture, this is from the EU Soil Observatory, and this speedometer view is coming from that Soil Observatory model's data across Europe. And it's telling us that for all of the soil degradation processes it's tracking and modelling, that 62% of the EU soils are subject to more than one degradation process. And to respond to this, we've got the EU Soil Strategy, which is aiming for healthy soils by 2050. And a pillar of that is the development of a soil monitoring law. So what's striking about soil is that, unlike water or air, it doesn't at the moment have like a framework directive. So that's one of the things that the soil strategy is trying to address. And if we zoom in on that soil observatory data for Ireland, now bearing in mind the context of this is that it's modelled data across Europe. So it's probably not granular enough to give us a picture of the exact conditions in Ireland, which we would get from our own local monitoring data, but it does give you an indication of how we're doing. So those areas in orange and the darker shades are where there is more than one soil degradation process that's been identified through the models. So it looks like there's issues that we need to address, and to do that, one of the responses is the soil monitoring law. So that's going to ask us to define soil districts and to develop criteria for how we're going to assess soil ecological status. And it's got some pointers to things that we need to consider in the annex of the proposed directive. We've got to figure out the methodologies that we're going to use to assess our soil ecological status. We're going to have to select sampling locations so that we can go and do that monitoring and assessment. We're going to have to register contaminated and potentially contaminated sites. And this will all lead to an assessment of soil health, which will have to be done within a set period of that law coming into force. So back to land now, but I segued into soil because soil and land use are intrinsically linked. And every decision that you make about land use really literally has to start from the bottom up, because your soil type, your soil characteristics, and your soil health will drive what decisions are important to make. So just to give a kind of a rough example of that, If you're making a decision about where to kind of seal your soil and build something, maybe you wouldn't want to do it on sort of productive agricultural or horticultural soils. Those are the kinds of decisions that you want to make from the bottom up. Again, how you use your peat soils. Soil should be the centre of your land use decisions. And you need good information to do that, which I'll get to later. So moving to land, again, starting with the key messages. So we can see evidence that our land use practices as they stand are exerting pressure on our environment. And I'll elaborate on that. But that can be fixed by changing our approach to how we use land. That's the good news. This is, I suppose, if that was easy, we'd be doing it. So it does require a new approach that will bring challenges, but ultimately will be beneficial in more than one way, and we have evidence to back that up. And that even though we're talking about land, the central part of all of this is people, and the ability to bring people along and incentivise good practices is so important to the success of anything that we want to do on land use. So what is Ireland's land? Well, this image is the new national landcover map that was developed by Tailte Éireann with the support of the EPA. And it shows you, if you have seen this data, and I think Andy showed us a screenshot of it earlier, but it goes down to a really detailed level, 0.1 of a hectare, to identify Ireland's land cover. And while that map is lovely, it's kind of hard to see the patterns, so we've turned that map into a graph. And this stacked bar graph will show you what Ireland's land is, and more than half of it is grassland, and a lot of that being used for agricultural purposes. Between forest and woodland, you're getting up around 12%, then in around 6%-ish for scrub, hedgerows and tree lines, peatland, heath and bracken, cultivated land. Artificial surfaces, small but significant at 3.8%, and then the water bodies and the exposed surfaces. So that's our country, that's Ireland's land. And another aspect of Ireland's land was studied for the land use review. So there was a land use review proposed in the programme for government, and the EPA led on phase 1 of this, which was just to gather the evidence about land use across loads of different aspects. And one of the aspects we looked at was who owns it. So at a high level, we were able to identify that 78% of Ireland's land is privately owned. So knowing our land cover regime at the moment and knowing the ownership profile already gives you a basis for which phase 2 of the land use review can kick off. So there's existing reports and sort of cycles of reporting for nature for part of nature under the Habitats and Species and the Habitats Directive reporting. Like the EPA has air quality monitoring programs and water quality monitoring programs you'll hear more about this afternoon. And we have a regular reporting cycle that updates and tells us what is the water quality in Ireland, what is the air quality in Ireland. But at the moment, we don't have a land quality in Ireland report. So to gather the evidence for phase 1, we had to look across existing data. And if you do that, you can pick up signs of places where existing land use practices are exerting pressure on the environment. And this is got from information, say if you look at the Habitats Directive, there's information in there about the drivers of some of the status of habitats and species. Similarly, if you look at the characterisation that's done for river basin management planning, you're seeing those pressures, and then you can link them back to certain land use practices. So we did this assessment really just to find what indicators are out there that could be used, that could give us some signal. Now, I should caveat this by saying if you're looking for indicators, you're drawing that from monitoring programs or from assessments, and nobody really does that unless there's a problem. So this does skew towards the negative. And this was an environmental study. We didn't consider the social and economic aspects, which is another aspect that could be added into this whole indicator view of things. But across the domains of air, water, food, habitats, and the ability to sustain for generations, we found evidence of indicators where we could see that land use was having a negative impact on the environment across these domains. And I should also say we didn't size them. That's another direction we could go. So as well as expanding the indicator set, you could try and quantify these dots. We were just looking for presence and absence so we could start to build a picture. And this was done for phase 1. But if we kind of summarise the highlights that we've put in the chapter, at the moment, land is a net source of greenhouse gas emissions. That our current land use practices are putting pressure on water quality. That our current land use practices are putting pressure on biodiversity. That land use is resulting in soil sealing. And we saw earlier that that's at 3.8% are artificial surfaces, so that's your tarmac, your concrete, your hard surfaces. But that has actually increased, it's doubled since 1990, and we're tracking that through the Korean landcover data. So even though it's a small area, it's growing for itself, it's growing quite quickly. And then if you take those sealed areas where they come together to form urban land patterns, they themselves, as a set of land uses, are contributing to air and water pressures and also to greenhouse gas emissions. So that's where we are, and that's, as I said, Ireland, that's our country as a graph. And we're not making any more land. So, and we've also heard from some of the questions this morning, we're losing it in some places to coastal erosion. So if we can't make more of it, and we've got loads of demands of it, it stands to reason we're going to have to find a multi-benefits approach to how we manage our land. And if we look across all of the policies and the strategies that are out there, which we did in the chapter a little bit, we just focused on the environmental themed ones, but there are more that we could have looked at. There's two kinds of targets. So there's the conservation target. So this is where you've got a certain kind of land cover or land use and you want to keep it. So the obvious one here is peatlands, where we're setting targets for ourselves to restore and rehabilitate peatland, and we're saying we want that to stay peatland, we don't want that to be harvested, we want to do other things with it. The nature restoration law will bring targets around no net loss of urban green spaces. There's agricultural targets around keeping a ratio permanent grassland to agricultural area ratio. The EU soil strategy brings with it a no net land take, which means no more sealing or kind of compensating for any sealing that you do. We have seen in the transport chapter the need for a modal shift in transport, which might have infrastructure impacts, and we've seen the move across Europe to this idea of compact growth, which again would kind of help with the no net land take. So that's the keep it as it is targets. And then there's the targets and from policies and strategies where there's an implication that land would be used. Now, there's nothing stopping it being a multi-use, but these things all come with demands for land. So increases in ecosystems may or may not demand land. Afforestation targets, we need somewhere to put the trees. We've already spoken about housing, an increase in housing supply, the need to expand our active transport infrastructure, the increase in area under tillage, and the need to increase renewables, which all, it's difficult to quantify, but they all bring some kind of ask for land, which is definitely a finite resource. So it stands to reason, if we've got these demands and we have this evidence of pressures, that a new approach is needed. And one view of it, I suppose maybe the first step in a new approach is taking a different view. So under phase one, in the social and economic study that was done, Professor Mark Scott came forward with this capitals view, which is gaining ground. So here the idea is land use in itself is always done for economic and social good. So there's a reason why you're using land the way that you are. But that to continue to do that, you have to understand that that exists within the realm of natural capital. So the natural capital is the land and all the things, and the soil and all the things that are happening on that land, and we're using them for social and economic, but the social and economic capitals are entirely nested within the natural. So it's this view that if we want to continue to get this economic and social and cultural good, that we need to protect the natural capital so that we can sustain the ability to do that. So that gives you a framework within which to think about land use. So if we think about where we are now in terms of pressures, the one thing that's different about land is a change in approach can turn land use from being a pressure into being a solution. And changes in approach can turn land from a net source of greenhouse gas emissions into a sink. And hopefully in future SOE reports, that's what we want to be reporting. That you can change how you're using land to protect and improve water quality. You can do the same for biodiversity. You can use land recycling methods to stabilise that whole rate of soil seeding. And we can kind of reframe how we're designing our urban spaces to limit air and water pressures and greenhouse gas emissions. The first part of that new approach is the vision for it. What does it look like? And even though this isn't from, like Scotland do lead the way in terms of land use planning, and they're kind of on a third cycle where they're espousing this multi-benefits approach. But this is from Adaptation Scotland's pages. But what they do here is sort of say, this is what it's like now, and then this is what an adapted community would look like. And if you dig into that and kind of navigate those pages, you'll see a lot of the changes here are land use changes that are kind of providing those kind of solutions. And this new approach is not a pipe dream in terms of the evidence that people are generating for this. And in phase one, we looked across a lot of countries to find patterns or approaches where people were taking new approaches to land use. But a recent study that we referenced in the report is the Climate Council in Denmark study, where they modelled scenarios for future land use. And here they took 3 scenarios. One started with, we're just going to solve our climate problems and reach our climate targets, to we want to look at our biodiversity and our water quality targets. And what they found is when you bundle those things and take a multi-benefits kind of multi-thematic approach to it, you achieve your goals all in tandem. And costs was mentioned as an aspect this morning, but it's actually more cost effective to do it this way. So in their study, they found that the scenarios they modelled where they just looked at climate sort of helped solve the climate problems but didn't bring the water and biodiversity good. But when they looked at the scenarios for solving water and biodiversity problems together, that brought the climate good with it. So it's good evidence to show that this is not necessarily a new approach, is not necessarily a pipe dream, that this can be done. But I suppose, where does that leave us? Well, to do this, you need 3 things. And this is some of the things that are coming now from phase 2 of the land use review. So phase 1 finished with lots of reports and 19 recommendations, but it really did just look at the evidence. It didn't get into visioning or policy solutions or any of the levers that we can use. But one thing that did come from those 19 recommendations is a view of the importance of really good information. So we know we've got land demands and objectives, and if we bring them together in a big pile and cross-reference them, we can see synergies and we can see conflicts. So that's one piece of evidence. If we bring indicators of land use impact, that helps us to track for signs of any potential problems or potential solutions. But as I said, there's no one magic piece of data that's going to tell you this is what you should do with your land. This is layers, and it literally starts from the bottom up with good data about soil, the characteristics, the soil health and the soil ecosystems. You need to think about your existing land cover. That's another layer, which we have now from the National Land Cover Map, and which Tailte Éireann will produce every 6 years. We're moving into land use mapping now, and more work is being done on landscape characterisation. And what's really important to think about as well is those ecosystems, those terrestrial ecosystems, the extent of them, their conditions, their services. These are just some of the layers that you would bring together to make a good land use decision. But you also need to think about the social and economic dimensions, and you need to think about the connected dimensions. You need to think about the impacts on water, on marine, on air, on greenhouse gas emissions, and on human health. And then if you have all of this data, and you can use it to give you this complete systems view that you can plug into social and economic dimensions, you need to continue to do that over time so that as you change things, you can look for evidence of an impact. And that's something Jenny alluded to earlier as well in terms of the agriculture and water measures. So the EPA and the Land Evidence Forum are starting to build a vision for what a land evidence hub would need to have in it. And then also under phase 2, as I mentioned earlier, what's really important here, given Ireland's land ownership profile and also those cultural and economic aspects, is people. So there's a lot of research being sponsored by the EPA Fast Track to Policy programme for phase 2 that looks into those dimensions. And Rory O'Donnell is also chairing a citizens engagement working group to kind of dig into how you can bring people along on a land use change journey. Then there's, for phase 2, there's the oversight committee and the technical working group, and more of those fast track to policy researches, which will start to get into the vision and policies and plans over time. So where does that leave us? Well, this is the 5 messages from the SOE report. And if we look at each of these messages, which I won't do, but if you did, you can see that land has a massive part to play in each and every one of these 5 priorities. And I go so far as to say that if we were able to get a land use vision, that would kind of help an awful lot to progress in this national policy position, because land use is so important. But the ability to use land differently is transformative in terms of solving air, water, biodiversity, and climate problems, and it's also essential for human health. Thank you very much.